So today we are going to talk about Section 15, the Social Inequality and Media Representation, Part 2. So the other day we didn't have a very long lecture because really what we were doing is just talking about statistics and demographics and things like that, and I just didn't feel like there was really that much meat on the bone as far as like showing you things, talking through those things. This will be different because we're now at the point where we can actually see clips in the media talking about these concepts that I'll be introducing today. So we can actually get back to like watching things that describe this stuff. So we talked about issues of inclusion, and so what I want to do now is focus more on roles and control. And so when we talk about roles, a lot of what we're talking about are stereotypes and what's shown in the media. So let's talk about, again, how African Americans for the most part have been portrayed throughout time. If we look at, and I'm sorry, I've got a little bit of a chest cold, so if I cough in the middle here, I don't mean to blow your eardrums up when I do, but for example, I had to cough there. That's why I was talking about it. We look at the first portrayals of blacks in the media. We really see them as kind of dim-witted, folksy simpletons. We had talked about earlier how you had entertainers, servants, these kind of roles. So if we look at the beginning days of mass media, really, popular books, television, radio, things like that, even performances. These dim-witted, folksy simpletons, entertainers that we would call minstrel shows. And later that term would kind of be co-opted and turned into something else, in which you would have white performers putting on black makeup to pretend as if they were minstrels. So minstrels were like were comedic entertainers, right? Song and dance men that were up on stage to entertain. You had things, and what I'll show you is an old cartoon called Little Black Sambo. Little Black Sambo is this child that is raised, and it's a weird kind of environment because everyone's speaking English. You get the impression that this is taking place in America, the storyline, but yet they're in the jungle, and Little Black Sambo is this little boy who is constantly afraid of this tiger that's around. And I can show you a little more of what I mean by that. It was a popular children's book, and then became a cartoon, and so I can remember even having one of the Little Black Sambo books growing up. It was a leftover. It may have been one of my parents' books that they had when they were children. I'm not sure, but I know I've seen that book before, and I believe it was in my house growing up with the rest of the children's books. But we definitely had a lot of Uncle Remus stories at the house. Again, I grew up in Georgia, and in particular, my aunt lived in a town called Edenton, Georgia. Edenton was the birthplace of Joel Chandler Harris, who is the journalist with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. On the side, he wrote these stories up under the pen name of Uncle Remus. And so what Uncle Remus was, if you've ever heard stories about Brer Rabbit, Brer Fox, these are characters that is kind of like Aesop's fables, or children's bedtime stories that have these little moral lessons within them. Uncle Remus is Joel Chandler Harris writing this book as if he's an old slave telling children these stories about Brer Rabbit. Now, Brer is a abbreviation of brother, brother rabbit, brother fox, brother bear. And so you get this old slave who is beloved by little children, both black and white. But when Joel Chandler Harris writes this book, he writes it phonetically so that if you read it, and maybe I'll find some samples, if you read it, it tries to make you say things in broken English, much like a slave would. Now, talking about this Uncle Remus character also brings up this other facet, this thing called Uncle Tom. Uncle Tom is this stereotype of the house Negro, is another term that's been used. So you think about a slave that kind of appreciates their status among the other slaves. Maybe they stay in the house all the time. Maybe they are given some administrative duties. And we're talking, a lot of what we're talking about today is going to be slave lingo, slave names, slave language. So if you think about, if anyone's ever seen Django Unchained, the Samuel L. Jackson character is an Uncle Tom character. And a lot of people say that Uncle Remus is kind of like that. It's kind of like this black man who is a slave, but he has somewhat a position of power and tells these stories to kids. So we see things like that. Later on, we will see movies and film try to portray Africans as animalistic criminals. Africa has a very rich, deep history, but American media has painted Africa as though it is ahistorical, as though it was all people running around in the jungle in loincloths until the slave ships arrived. It ignores the rich history of Africa. So when you see film and everything, mass entertainment develop, it harkens back to talking about African Americans as savages, wild men. And as you saw white supremacy grow throughout America after the Civil War, the birth of the KKK, things like that, you start seeing more and more portrayals of African Americans as these savage criminals. In the 40s and 50s, as film is really starting to hit its golden age, we would say, and you have all these brilliant black and white movies that are being made, and also TV is coming to fruition at this point, you're starting to see perhaps more blacks in entertainment, but they're still pigeonholed into a few key stereotypes. Again, remember we talked about the entertainer, we talked about the servant, so there's those roles. If we look at what some people have written, scholars have written regarding stereotypical representations of African Americans in the media, there's a few key stereotypes that were predominant for a very, very long time. And when the scholars write about these stereotypical roles, what they make out, what they make mention of, is that, again, these roles harken back all the way to the days of slavery and how you used to categorize your slaves into what positions they served and what kind of social power they would have among the slaves. So if we look at some of these early film and television stereotypes, you get stereotypes, roles that we call the buck, the trickster, the mammy, the shrew. Okay, so these are slave categories as well. The buck was always your strongest, most powerful slave. And just like you would call a deer a buck, you know, the kind of leader of everything, the one that decides who he's going to the deer, who he's going to mate with, and that term was also given to slaves. The buck was your strongest guy. You wanted him to have a lot of children because you were hoping the children would be just as strong as the dad. So, I have a picture here of the guy from the Green Mile, who has since passed away, but he was very much a buck character. Ving Rhames, very much a buck character. Anybody who's this, large, strong hulk of a man, that people have noted that seems like a buck character. Again, Django Unchained, it's a really good movie to use as an example for a lot of this stuff. But in Django Unchained, what you have is you have a white plantation owner that takes part in slave fighting. And so he'll take his plantation's buck against another plantation's buck, and they'll have those slaves fight to the death, right? So you see that language also raised up in Django Unchained, where the plantation owners will call these guys bucks. Another stereotypical role you'll see is the trickster. This is kind of the comedic foil, the person that's always cutting jokes, that's trying to be witty, that's trying to be clever. Maybe they're pulling a scam, maybe they're a con artist. This actually goes back, calling this person the trickster, goes back into African mythology, and it's interesting. It is a mythology used by many tribal cultures, where you have this animalistic mythology, meaning that there are animal characters that reoccur throughout the myths. So, for example, in African cultures, that animal was always the rabbit. The rabbit was small, wiry, cutting jokes, funny, but very witty and a master strategist, so that the trickster was always trying to figure out how to get what he wants. And that, if that meant playing tricks and games on people and being funny and goofy and all that, then so be it. So people talk about characters like Martin Lawrence, Chris Rock, Dave Chappelle, these characters being trickster characters. And it's no wonder we talk about the rabbit being the African trickster. If you think about it, the cereal used the same concept. The breakfast cereal. Trix is for kids, but Trix is a rabbit. The rabbit is the mascot there, the symbol. And it's just playing off of that African mythology, actually, of the rabbit as trickster. In Native American cultures, the trickster is the coyote. So you'll see in a lot of tribal mythology / religion that there's usually an animal, there's usually a species that's thought of as the trickster. If we look at the female roles, we tend to see in the past a stereotype of mammy and a stereotype of shrew. So what do we mean by that? Mammy is also kind of like the housemaid of the plantation. So she cooks, she cleans, she takes care of the children in the house, the owner's children, and she can be very, very opinionated and very forceful as a woman, given a little bit of power, because she's basically running the house. She's, if something needs to be washed, cleaned, fed, whatever, she's in charge of it. Probably the most famous portrayal of this is actually Hattie McDaniels in Gone with the Wind. She plays the character actually named Mammy, and this is a picture of her right here. She's also the first African American to win an Oscar, and we can kind of talk about that too. But that was her role. The Flip side of that coin is the shrew. Again, this is a character in Gone with the Wind, played by Butterfly McQueen, was her name. And the shrew is the annoying one. The voice annoys you. The actions annoy you. She's timid, but she's mouthy. She's scared, anxious, nervous. So that's the shrew. People even talking about in Martin Lawrence on his television show Martin, people made out the fact that Pam was always thought of as a shrew character. Pam was the one, the girlfriend of Gina, Martin's love interest Gina, but Pam was the one that always annoyed Martin. And there's several people wrote that Pam was playing this role as a shrew. And Martin was playing the role of a trickster. What's also been interesting now that I'm thinking about it is because there were a couple of articles written on Martin when it came out dealing with race. Was this discussion, which has always existed, but Martin kind of people picked up on it in Martin too, that Gina was light-skinned while Pam was darker skinned, and how that when we talk about race, even within racial groups, racism exists due to skin color. How lighter skinned blacks are favored over darker skinned blacks. And so, and that was also to point out that, when you talk about, excuse me, when you talk about African Americans in media, when you talk about Asians, when you talk about Latinos, whenever you talk about these minority groups in the media, we tend to think about it as, well, white people versus that minority group. Thinking about in terms of white people versus black people, white people versus Hispanics, white people against or versus Asians. And the conversation out there is usually highlighted as well that, look, racism doesn't just occur between those two groups. Racism can be an intra thing as well as an inter thing. That there is racism within the group that you're talking about. And so that's interesting because when you talk about television and you talk about portrayals and you talk about positive portrayals of race or negative portrayals of race, you tend to think of that racial group, that minority group, as all being on the same page, as everyone being lumped together. But we definitely see that no, there is no one black point of view. There are individual points of view of people who happen to be black. But it's not tokenism. No one character is supposed to represent the totality of what it means to be black or to be Hispanic. So we have those stereotypes. What I usually like to do is just talk a little bit about history of roles on television, because I think it's interesting to note what's been out there and where what we would call African American television or black television, where it gets its start and how it develops over time. If you actually look at one of TV's first broadcasts, was a variety show. And it starred Ethel Waters, who was a black entertainer and actress. So she had a variety show where she would invite guests on in the early days of television. Now, when she became popular enough among white audiences, she was put on a show called Beulah, and she was the maid, Beulah. So she was kind of a star of this show. But it really was, there was, and if I could remember, there was a version of this show with a white maid, and I'll have to remember what the name was. But the show was basically named after the maid. The maid is kind of like the central figure, the narrator almost. But what you're really doing is paying attention to the family. The narrative is turning around the family. Something happens with a little boy in the show, and he's caught cheating or stealing, and how's the mom or dad going to address this, whatever. And for the most part, in the backdrop is just the maid. Well, that's kind of the same thing that Beulah was for Ethel Waters. Now, as civil rights got more important and started taking huge gains, you started to see roles on television for African Americans change. The first show that we get that's considered a black television show, in other words, the main character and who all the narrative revolves around, as opposed to like being a background character, the first show that looks at intensely at a black character is Julia in 1968. Julia, over here in this image down here, she's played by Diane Carroll. This was kind of viewed as a black pluralist show, although there were white and black people on the show. The cast predominantly was a black cast, and while it had black characters and treated those black characters as the stars of the show, you did not get into many racial episodes where the narrative revolved around Julia being treated differently. We see this in a lot of television in the 60s, where you have these black characters that are on TV, but not a lot is made out of the racism issue. Because, again, it kind of goes back to these myths that Herb Schiller had, which is if you have a show that's entertaining with black people on it, if it entertains a white audience, that's good. But as soon as it starts causing controversy, as soon as it starts impacting advertising and drives advertisers away, then that'll stop, right? So it didn't really do much to explore deep racial issues, the show. But it did have a black female lead that the show was based around. So if we think about 60s television, kind of what I said was, it's the same on this slide here. You had race not really treated as being an issue in this type of 60s television. Down here I use the word assimilating. This is actually what a lot of this was viewed as, assimilationist television, in which you treat television and the black characters as though race really isn't a problem. It's almost as if it's non-existent racism. So you get shows like I Spy, Mission Impossible, Star Trek, where you don't really address race that well. You assume that everyone's okay with racial differences. But that's not really how things are going in the real world during that time. In the 70s television, you have this mentality, and this was kind of a 1970s, especially as we were around the bicentennial of the country, thinking about race coming together, where we've gotten through the civil rights movement, and now the country is trying to heal. And it's trying to figure out how it does that. You had a lot of metaphors of America being said as a melting pot. Excuse me. So you have this belief, this ideology that blacks, whites, Hispanics, Asians, whoever, should come together as an American people and not worry so much about their differences as being black, as being white, as being Hispanic, as being Asian. You had this shift from saying, put all those things aside and come together in a melting pot, which sounds admirable until you start thinking about what it's really asking. It's really asking you, ignore your own culture, right? Ignore your own background. That doesn't matter now that you're American. And so over time, during the 70s and the 80s, people started replacing this melting pot metaphor. And I won't say replacing it with this new term salad bowl. There's one scholar that tried to push this really hard, saying America doesn't need to be a melting pot. It should be viewed as a salad bowl. Salad bowl never took off. It's just a horrible metaphor. Melting pot took a hold. People understood that analogy and appreciated it, but the whole theory of salad bowl was that, you know, each race brings its own unique flavor, its own unique culture to the country. And so instead of melting everything together, you celebrate the diversity, just like how there's so much stuff in a salad. You celebrate that when it all comes together, it makes for a richer country, so to speak. And so you start having this shift in the late 70s and into the 80s where you're saying, okay, well, let's not portray things as assimilationist. Let's not assimilate things. Let's celebrate diversity. One of the things that's also coming during the 70s is this movement of film called blaxploitation film. Kind of this mixture of the term black and exploitation. Okay, so what you had here, again, it's primarily a business-related deal, where the film studios now realize, especially after civil rights, if you think about theaters in the old days, probably how your grandparents went to go see movies, you had a black section, you had a white section. White section was always better, right? The black section would be in the back of the balcony somewhere, and the chairs wouldn't really work, and you had that separation. Well, when civil rights is coming through, and once we kind of break up the segregation of things, film studios who had not worried about making films for black audiences now realize there's money to be made by targeting a black audience, right? So what comes out is this period of blaxploitation, where film studios are you know, they're eager to try to figure out what works among black audiences. So they're putting together these movies that are supposed to talk about what it's like to be African American in the U.S. and having black actors, stories that revolve around things that would happen in African American culture across the United States. The problem is that the studios were trying to tell stories about black people, but the people in charge of those studios weren't black. They were white. So it's a white man, a white director, or a white screenwriter writing and producing and directing for black actors. And the reason why we call it blaxploitation, the exploitation part of that, is that people started to realize these movies don't really paint African Americans in a positive light. You had TV, or you had movies that came out like Shaft, Dolomite, Superfly. These are movies that portray its main actors as criminals and thugs, or detectives who say break the law to figure out their cases. Reformed drug dealers in the case of Dolomite and Superfly. So this argument came about that was like, okay, we understand these movies are supposed to be made for African Americans, but all you really do is just further negative stereotypes in them. So looking back at it now, African Americans view blaxploitation as bad. At the time, in the 70s, audiences were happy that there's movies being made for us. right? For African Americans, the studios are finally saying, you deserve your own films. Later on, though, they start to take note and notice how, those films did not do us justice. So, should stereotypes still dominate? And I think that's not titled correctly. I think what I'm asking is, why do stereotypes still dominate? But, and I understand why I'm saying should, is because what I'm talking about is the why. Why do they dominate? Or why shouldn't they dominate? Why should we be in a different place now with stereotypes than what we actually are? And what I'm doing is I'm trying to make an argument here. If you look at the history of television, and this seems like a weird non sequitur here, but it'll make sense in a minute. If we look at the history of the spread of television, by August of '98, cable captured more TV households than ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox combined. So what am I saying by that? I'm saying that by the end of the '90s, you had more people watching cable television than you did the traditional broadcast networks, right? So more people are watching cable. Also, by the end of the '90s, 70 million out of 100 million homes had cable. This is also known as a diffusion rate. Whenever you talk about a percentage of the population that has something, we can look at the rate and call it a diffusion rate. In other words, if 70 million out of 100 million homes have cable, then you look at the end of the '90s and you say, well, by the end of the '90s, cable television had roughly a 70% diffusion rate. In other words, 70% of households had it, right? So, why do these things matter? Because what we're saying is that you no longer really have to look at cable as being primarily held by white people and broadcast primarily by black people. What you're saying is that by the end of the '90s, there are a lot of homes out there that have cable, and people are actually watching that cable. They're choosing the cable programming over ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, right? So if we know that the cable is out there and that lots of people are watching it, and then you take into account another kind of figure from the '90s. Blacks watched an average of 70 hours per week of television, while non-blacks watched 47 hours. So you had black audiences watching way more television than other audiences. Well, if you know that people are watching a lot of cable, and there's a lot of cable subscriptions out there, and blacks tend to watch more television than whites, what you would think is that there would be more programming catering specifically to African Americans. You would think that there would be this huge jump. And indeed, by the end of the '90s, we do start seeing that the inclusion rate of characters in shows that are black starts to match, if not go beyond, what the actual percentage population is of African Americans, right? So by the end of the '90s, you have all of these things coming together. So you would expect there to be a big change in television. Lots of black characters, lots of black actors, lots of screenwriters, directors, producers, studios that are black. You would expect a lot of that, right? But we still see stereotypes to this day. We still see what some people call modern racism, which is, even though you have the inclusion of black characters in film and TV, and you've gotten rid of your traditional form of racism, we still see, and in fact we're exposed to a newer type of racism, a replacement of the traditional form. The traditional form of racism is what we're all used to in watching the black and white films of black people being treated like idiots, black people being injured and harmed, spit on, lynched, whatever. That good old-fashioned hate, right, for lack of a better term. That's traditional racism. Modern racism is hostility, rejection, and denial by whites towards the activities and aspirations of black people. So it can be more of an institutional racism, right? Modern racism isn't as overt. It isn't as easily seen. But then you go in and you start investigating things. Institutional racism, how the system, the status quo, your institutions, these tend not to equally help a black society as it does a white. And I was trying to think of a good example. I'll tell you this. So I have a buddy who is a scoutmaster, not in Starkville, but in another town. And we've discussed this for a long time, in that his Boy Scouts are getting more homogenous. They're starting to look the same more and more. And what he says is, what my friend who's a scoutmaster says, is that there's almost no African American, Hispanic kids in his troop. And when you ask why that is, he says, because it's a money thing. He said that their troop doesn't really do a lot of fundraisers, right? So when they need money for things, let's say they want to go on a trip, they want to go on a camp out, they want to visit someplace, that requires money. And that the scouts that he primarily has now are from richer families, white families. And so if they decide that they want to go, into Alabama and camp for 3 days, the white parents will just write a check for it and just pay for it outright and say, okay, go do it. He said that discourages minority kids who could really benefit from scouting. It discourages them from joining because they may not have the money. If you think about it, that's a form of modern racism. That is really kind of a denial of a program for kids based purely on economics. So is it old-fashioned hate? No. It's institutional. It's something that's inherent within a system that still creates problems for race, right? If they did a fundraiser, if every kid in that group had to work so many hours to earn so much money that could be spent only on the camp out, maybe the group would diversify. You get black kids that were coming in and working as many service hours as anybody else, and they're earning just as much money as anybody else, so they get to go on trips just as much as anybody else. But instead, there's this institutional problem. And until everyone kind of agrees that they're going to go back to fundraising, it's hard to change that, right? We've seen other examples in the media of this. If you look at news coverage of black people, it tends to focus on negative aspects instead of the positive aspects of African American culture. So we talk about the crime rate, and we show a lot during the evening news about, blue-collar crime, mugging, beating, murder, stuff like that. But how many times do you see white-collar crime on the news? Embezzlement, theft, cheating on taxes, not complying with government regulations. You don't see many mugshots of people for that. And it's not that it doesn't exist, it's that the news thinks that the coverage of those murderers and thugs and muggers and people who break into houses and whatnot. The news thinks that you'd be more interested in that. Whenever you have people that are interviewed in the news, you tend to see white people, when they speak, treated as if they speak for an entire community. And what I mean by that is you tend to see a white person asked a question and about something, some aspect, and they say, well, I think it's good for Starkville, you know. And what they're saying, or what people infer from it, is that, oh, okay, well, this person thinks it's good for everyone, whatever they're going to do. Oh, they're going to have a parade? Well, that's good for Starkville. That parade will be good for everybody, right? Versus when you see black people interviewed on television, and this has all been done through research to ask audience members how they interpret things. But when they see black people on television, they think, oh, okay, well, that person's just speaking for the black community, right? Well, the parade will be a good thing. Oh, well, and they interview and a black person says that, the audience thinks, oh, well, what they mean is that the parade would be good for the black community, not for all of Starkville. They're given a perspective just on being black, which is wrong. The people can be speaking for the entire community, but the audience has its own biases that it uses. Another example, if you look at Katrina, during Katrina, there's clips of this where you would have white people stealing food from the stores in New Orleans, and they would be talked about as survivors. These people are just doing what they have to do to get by. These people are doing what they have to do. They're stealing food. Or, you know, hey, they're stealing televisions and radios. Why are they doing that? Well, because they're going to hawk those. They're going to trade those for food. They're doing this so that they can live. Versus you'd see TV reports where black people were stealing the same items, and they would be called thieves, thugs, and looters. So there's still that form of racism that's going on. If you think about why that is, if you think about why that exists, if you think about what we said about the diffusion rate of cable and how if African Americans are watching more television and they have cable subscriptions just as much as white people, why haven't we seen more media that caters to an African American audience? Same is true about Hispanics, right? If we know that we have the predominant minority in America now is Hispanics, and we know that they're watching television, why would you not have more shows just for Hispanic audiences? It's a matter of control. Why do those things, why does that inequality exist? Well, it's because historically the media has been owned, operated, and staffed primarily by white people. So if you have only white writers, white producers, white directors, white editors, if you have staff and crew and cast and all, and everything tends to be white, then you see why there isn't much diversity in programming. Give you an example. Between 1978 and 2010, the percentage of minorities in actual newsrooms tripled, which sounds great until you realize that the tripling was from 4% to 13%. So if you think about the newsroom in that time, in the late 70s, 4% of the news writers were minorities. By 2010, some 30 years later, it's only gotten to 13%. If you look at all newsroom supervisors in the country at that time, only 11% were minorities, right? So if you look at the people that are actually the agenda setters and the gatekeepers, 89-90% white. Half of the newspapers that responded to a survey in 2010 said they had no minorities at all on their full-time staff. Half of newspapers, no minority full-time staffers, right? So, In class, we'll probably watch some clips. I've got Little Black Sambo, Julia, Superfly. I've got various other things also that we'll take we'll take a look at in class. But that is the end of the lecture for today, and I look forward to seeing you in class.